Good afternoon, everybody. I want to begin with a quick microphone check. If you could give me a thumbs up if you're able to hear me okay, thank you. I want to begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to all of you for joining us on this special Valentine's Day webinar. And I see old friends who have hopped on again. Amber, thank you for being there, and several of you who have been regulars with us. I'm very grateful that you made time to join us on this Valentine's Day webinar called Intimacy for Dummies Like Me. So thank you all for being here. From the bottom of my heart, I send you my love and um, my gratitude to all of you, and a happy Valentine's Day wishes. I hope you spend it enveloped by an ocean of love and are in the presence of loving thoughts and loving feelings. So let's talk about intimacy, and there are a few books that I'm drawing from extensively today, so it will be in the fitness of things that I introduce you to those books. Excellent days for books, reads for Valentine's Day. This one is by Osho. It's called Love, Freedom, and Aloneness, the Cone of Relationships. The Cone of Relationships. Love, Freedom, and Aloneness by Osho. Very interesting and rich book. Another one is, of course, my all-time favorite, which is Intimacy by Osho. Talks about intimacy not just with others, but also with oneself. Another one based on the writings of Khalil Gibran and the Prophet. It's Osho's commentary on the Prophet. It says, Speak to Us of Love by Osho. And finally, Love, Relationship, and Marriage by Osho. So I want to celebrate these books and share with you a little bit about what I found very interesting or inspiring through my lens as I understood whatever I was capable of understanding. The first thing to remember is that everybody is afraid of intimacy. Sometimes we know it and sometimes we don't know it, but to varying degrees, we're all afraid of intimacy. And the irony also is that all of us crave intimacy. There are few things in life that we find to be as healing or as therapeutic as the experience of intimacy. And yet it is something that we are afraid of. Now, intimacy requires a kind of softness, a kind of vulnerability. Whereas being in the real world, the so-called real world outside, the marketplace, the organizations, the businesses, what we seem to need is more of a kind of hardness, a hard and cunning nature. And intimacy requires precisely the opposite. And in fact, Osho reminds us that of Lao Tzu's words, that when man is born, he's soft and tender. When he dies, he's hard and stiff. And therefore, softness and tenderness is one of the best companions to intimacy. We also need to be aware of the zeitgeist we are in, the time, the climate of modernity. There are three modalities that have become so popular in the climate of modernity. One is the mechanical modality, where we're all trying to be efficient and productive, and we are going through the day very efficiently. As you can recognize, intimacy requires us to go beyond efficiency to the richness of being fully present and fully immersed in a very emotional and connected encounter with another. So the mechanical modality of modern life goes against the spirit of intimacy. The logical and intellectual modality too, because so much of our education turns us into logical beings, capable of being logical. And at the same time, intimacy requires us to have a deep sensitivity to the emotional realm and the subtle nuances of emotional reciprocity that and the dance of intimacy requires. And the third is the economic modality, where we have been trained to see life through economic terms. What did I put into something versus what I got out of it? And that's one of the challenges, because love and intimacy is a phenomenon where if you don't think in a return on investment paradigm and you just give and you just love unselfishly with no concern for what you're getting back in return, that's when you get back so much more in return. The irony is that you have to let go of any concern, and the divinity that comes from being able to express your love towards another being or towards anything is something that is purifying, something that is so beautifully transcendental when there is no calculation of what you'll get back. Intimacy is one of the represents, and relationships represent one of the most powerful opportunities for spiritual partnership. Osho reminds us that many of our qualities, the beautiful qualities that we have of generosity, trust, think of all of them, they come up only in relationship. If I was sitting by myself alone on top of a mountain and meditating, it's very unlikely that I would be drawn into situations where those beautiful qualities can come up. Or even the not so beautiful qualities, the anger that I have, the lack of generosity, the lack of trust, maybe my selfishness, my ego. Notice that the beautiful side of us, as well as the more challenging aspects of us, are exposed only in relationship. And therefore, the only way to look at a relationship is to look at it as a spiritual partnership to go through and not necessarily be disheartened by your own glimpses of what's inside you. Sometimes a relationship will bring out elements of possessiveness, domination, rather than to reject yourself for that. It just gives you, what it is that we still have to work through, but it creates the context in which you can go. And therefore, Osho says it is the other is like a mirror. It is you, the mirror, that is making me feel so ugly or feel so beautiful. The other becomes like a mirror. In that mirror, we see our own reflection. Another challenge of intimacy is many of us are trying how to learn to love. And it seems like it has to be rephrased. The challenge is not to be loving, but there are many ways of being unloving that we have been conditioned into, or through earlier experiences that might have hurt or destroyed our trust and capacity to give, that has been thwarted. So learning the ways of unlove, says Osho, is a more important challenge than learning the ways of love. The other beautiful thing about love is when love is real, nothing can frustrate it. Why? Because when love is real, it comes with no expectations. So nothing can frustrate real love. But by the same corollary, nothing can satisfy unreal love. How many of us have known situations in relationships we've been in where no matter what you do, it doesn't seem to be satisfying, because when there are expectations and the love is not necessarily real, it has not seasoned and matured, no amount of what you do can actually fulfill it, and it'll always fall short. I want to quote, before I move on, the beautiful words of Khalil Gibran, on love and relationships. So take a moment to take these words in deeply. Let there be spaces in your togetherness, and let the winds of heavens dance between you. Love one another, but make not a bond of love. Let it rather be a moving sea between the shores of your souls. How poetic, how beautiful. Let it be a moving sea between the shores of your souls. Very, very inspiring. Okay, sorry. Um, there are a couple of things to remember in the context of intimacy that may have nothing to do with intimacy. It's so funny how our ways of being that have nothing to do with intimacy will often get projected on the screens of the relationships that we are in. One of them is an interesting thing that we have to become so aware of in terms of how the human mind works. For the human mind, anything that it achieves loses its value. So the mind is only interested in what you don't have, but true happiness and fulfillment can come from only what you already have. So look at how the gap is created. I can be happy only with what I have. How can I be happy imagining something I don't have? I can only be happy with what I have. But my mind functions in such a way that the moment I achieve something, it loses its value. This is one of the most corrosive elements in relationships, because we are all in relationships and we would have dreamed of being in these very relationships. Remember the courtship time and the time when you were seeking your partner. But notice how the context and the flavor of the relationship changes so much after you're in it. And that's one of the challenges for us to grow into, that really to be able to value the things we have. Otherwise, we take the people that we are with so much for granted. A relationship, says Osho, is a puzzle with no clue or solution. And what is that? That's precisely what we call a cone in this book, the cone of relationships. Love, freedom, and aloneness, the cone of relationships. A cone, a Zen cone, is what's the sound of one hand clapping? It's a puzzle with no solution. And relationships are puzzles with no solution. They're deeply mysterious. They can never be managed. You can't manage a relationship. Neither can you analyze it. The more you analyze it, the more elusive it becomes to our own understanding. It's not a problem to be solved, it's a mystery to be embraced. But Osho reminds us that before we can solve the cone of relationships or even begin to focus on it, there's another major challenge that we have to grapple with, which is the cone of our own aloneness. Until the problem that we face of being with ourselves in peace and wholeness can be resolved, it's almost impossible to see how we can relate to others. If our relationship with ourselves is broken, we hate ourselves, we don't dislike ourselves, we condemn ourselves, there is no way that we can relate to another person in a space where we can be able to love them and enjoy their presence and see their divinity. And therefore, it is the problem of love cannot be solved until we have first solved the problem of aloneness. Now, the irony, though, is that most of us are looking for relationships at a time when we are feeling miserable in our loneliness. And the challenge is that somebody else who's also looking for a relationship is perhaps miserable in their loneliness. And when two miserable people meet, what happens is that they just multiply the misery. So many mystics have warned us that before you enter into relationships, learn to enjoy life in aloneness. Celebrate your aloneness. Let aloneness and the silence of aloneness that it brings be one of the wings of the bird. And let love and relationship be the other wing of the bird. Just like a bird cannot fly with one wing, both these wings are needed. The wing of aloneness, so that you're whole and complete and content, and you're happy. And then when you meet somebody, rather than sharing your misery, you end up sharing your happiness. And two people sharing happiness has a multiplier effect. There is also a big paradox to embrace in relationships. It is beautiful to be alone. And when you start being alone, there's a time that comes where you feel, okay, it's time to enter in relationships. So often we go through these alternating cycles of craving aloneness and craving intimacy. Now notice, aloneness is very different from loneliness. Loneliness is a feeling of scarcity, a feeling of emptiness, whereas aloneness is a luxurious experience. It is magnificent. It is being able to celebrate the splendor and the wholeness of your own being. So what often happens is that when we are alone, we join with another. And there are almost like three dimensions to the relationship process. The very immature relationship is one where I'm seeking you out only to use you. It might be physical or emotional, but the other person is an object. I'm a subject, but the other person is an object to be manipulated and coerced and all of that. So I might use you emotionally or physically, but it's still where you're using somebody. It's the exploitative state, the stage of maturity. As you mature, you begin to enter into relationships that go beyond that, where the other becomes a full presence, and you are sharing the poetry that is arising in your heart, the music that is arising in your heart with another person, and celebrating them as a whole human being. Then the other person is not an object. Your agenda is not to use them, but to share with them. So you move from I-it relationships to I-thou relationships. Now there is a third stage, says Osho, where the other, in fact, ceases to exist and you cease to exist. And that is where you have transcended the idea of relationship. Granted, very few of us attain to that state, and sometimes you glimpse it. So I want you to be aware of those states where you can glimpse it. It doesn't have to be a permanent condition. It is something that we glimpse, because just the glimpsing of some things in life leaves us permanently transformed. It is the state where relationship implies two people, A and B. A oneness implies where the A and B have melted into one entity, where there's a transcendental oneness, that they don't exist as separate. For example, we talked about Khalil Gibran's quote that a relationship, the love is the river or the water between two shores. So there's a river flowing, the river of love, and there are two shores. Each of them represent a person. But can you see that these two shores seem to be separate only on the surface? Below, they are connected. It is so with human beings. We are all part of the same experience of the ocean of consciousness. We experience ourselves as separate entities. And being able to transcend that in oneness is something that happens in moments of deep intimacy. So, how do we relate to our relationships? There is the ordinary paradigm that many of us get stuck in for years. Are my needs being met in this relationship? If my needs are being met in this relationship, it's a good relationship. If my needs are not being met, it's not a good relationship. Osho challenges us to dance with a cosmic paradigm. And here's how he defines the cosmic paradigm. If you are growing more and becoming an individual, if life is happening more to you, if you are becoming more open, more beauty is felt in existence, if more poetry is arising in your heart, if more love flows through you, if you feel more compassion, if you're becoming more aware, then the relationship is good. So notice we then go beyond a need-based paradigm of relationship to a consciousness-based one. That if you're experiencing life more as a celebration and seeing the poetry of existence more when your relationship, then it's a good relationship. Now, there are some paradoxes in relationships, as we know. And one of the greatest paradoxes is that when you're alone, you feel lonely. But when we're at another, you start feeling after some time that the other is encroaching on your freedom. And so that's one of the paradoxes of how do you balance that. Another paradox is of the, how opposites attract, whether it's men and women or men and men and women, we are attracted to others who are opposite to us in some way. So the oppositeness of our personalities perhaps creates the attraction, but the same oppositeness that can bring people together, how many of you can see can actually start generating conflict? And that is why you often see in relationships that people who are drawn together, into such great intimacy, you know, by the polarity of their attraction, again start repelling each other, because the very opposition that created the relationship now starts creating the conflict. And the other paradox is that you can truly enjoy a great relationship only when you have outgrown the need for one. Otherwise, you're likely to use the relationship more as a crutch and less as something to be, as something that can be a partnership and a spiritual journey. One of the main challenges that we all have to confront in our relationship, and certainly I've had to deal with, is the family of origin issues, right? No families are perfect, and even the ones that we are born into have their own issues, and they leave us with many issues. One of the things to remember is that our capacity for love is often killed in childhood. Why? Because in most families, love is very conditional. So you're conditionally accepted, right? If you obey your parents, you're loved, and otherwise you often feel a sense of rejection and condemnation. So the capacity for love is killed in childhood, and the only kind of love that we learn is conditional love. Whereas really, for love to be love, it has to be unconditional. If we love other people only if they go along with our agenda and they listen to us, would that be real love? No, love has to be truly unconditional, but the kinds of lovingness that we learn in our childhood are very conditional. The other issue that many of you might have noticed, how many of you have noticed that in your romantic relationships, knowingly or unknowingly, you're repeating the same patterns of your parents? You'll be surprised that so often the relationships that you create will seem so much like the dynamics that were there between your parents. It's almost like a repetition that we become so conditioned. The roles that our parents fell into, we end up creating the same dynamics, and it's very interesting to see how that happens. Another aspect of the parents' influence is that you will often hear the voice of your parents advising you and guiding in your relationships. Many of us become our mothers and some of us become our fathers, and we play out patterns. And Gurdjieff, the French mystic, had something he used to say. He would refuse to work with anybody, in their spiritual journey unless they were at ease with their mother and father. And the problem has arisen there, he would say. Solve it there. Because if you have not solved the unfinished baggage of your own emotional life with your mother and father, be sure that it will haunt you and show up in every relationship that you have. Of course, it will show up in your professional relationships, but even more so with your romantic partners. So those are some of the family of origin issues for us to be aware of the ways in which the patterns that we absorbed from our childhood are going to perhaps be unwittingly, perpetuated in all of our romantic relationships. Then even bigger and or just as important is relationship with oneself issues, right? And there's a parable, beautiful parable Osho recites of a man who he's scared by his own shadow, and he is like afraid of his own footsteps. So he decides he's going to run from his own shadow and run from his own footsteps. So you will imagine what the result is, because no matter how fast he runs, the shadow is chasing him. And no matter how fast he runs, he's hearing the sound of his footsteps catching up. And finally, he keeps running so fast and fast because the mind tells him, maybe you're not running fast enough. And then he drops dead eventually. This parable is a reminder that each of us has a shadow side in us. Many of us have suppressed anger, jealousy, possessiveness, and we are so not at peace with the shadow side in us. We are running from it. We are trying to hide it from others. We are ashamed of the shadow side of us, and we try to suppress it. And because of the shame that we carry, we run from it ourselves. But we cannot run from ourselves. How could it be? It is illogical, because wherever you go, there you are, as somebody said. So what often happens is that if we have not come to peace with who we are and with the shadow side of ourselves, we are likely to be running from ourselves. And when intimacy becomes deeper, how many of us have known, and it's usually easy to see it in other people than with ourselves, we've been in relationships where the intimacy became so deep that you felt like the other person or you freaked out and ran from it, because there's always the fear, what if people see the shadow side of me that looks ugly to me, right? And then, of course, for those of you who've attended some of my other webinars, you're familiar with the idea of masks and unsobbed tears, that many of us carry sadnesses from our childhood and from earlier things that have happened to us. The unsobbed tears, as Osho calls them, that that we carry within us. And we reject ourselves. We don't accept ourselves. Many of us know that if we are sitting by ourselves, there's the voice of condemnation that's constantly condemning us. And it is so important for us to be aware of our masks. What are our masks? There are so many masks that we could be wearing. And often, if you look at the moments of sadness, shame, and disappointment you've had in life, you will see what were the ways in which you learned to cope with those moments. And those moments of fear and sadness and shame, we developed coping strategies, and we import those coping strategies into our relationships. And anything mechanical or formulaic, like a mask or a coping strategy that is brought into a relationship, is likely to pollute the relationship, because a relationship is a very dynamic, thriving, throbbing experience. It's vitality, it is life happening moment by moment to moment. Imagine if I bring rehearsed routines from my past and I enact them, that's not likely to be a thriving relationship. It's more likely to be a romantic relationships. So some of us have masks, like my mask is impressing others. I'm trying to impress you with this webinar. Appearing confident is another mask that people often wear. Being very conscientious, like making sure that we take care of everything that people ask us to take care of, could be a mask. It's a great quality, right? You get complimented for it. But how many of you can see that maybe that was a coping strategy because you were criticized often and it was so hurtful? So if you don't want to be criticized often, what you do is you become somebody who takes care of everything so nobody can ever criticize you. So if you have a quality that is getting you much praise, the spiritual perspective is to understand, how did I come to develop this strong suit? How did I come to develop this mask? How did I come to develop this quality? And for you in your partners to also join your partners in understanding the sources of our masks. Projecting a strong personality. Some of us will project a strong personality, even though inside we'll be feeling weak and scared. Others of us learn to intimidate and dominate others. Some of us, like me, appear to be nice. I come across as a nice person, just as a way of controlling other people and bribing them. Is that real niceness, or is it my strategy to cope with the fear that I experience in my relationships? Some of us are busy appearing smart. Some of us appear goofy and humorous all the time. So we all have masks. These were coping strategies. It's very important for us to look beneath the mask, because that's the pain we are running from. And for our relationships to grow deep and intimate and comforting, it is important we create a climate in which we and our partner can engage in the kind of deep sharing so that we are aware of each other's vulnerabilities, the pain points, and we can both stand and witness the pain that we carry with a tremendous level of compassion. Being able to experience pain is such an important part of growing deep relationships because love, as Freddie Mercury reminds us, love kills. If you haven't heard that Freddie Mercury song, I don't want you to think that his genius stopped with Bohemian Rhapsody. Love Kills is a very beautiful song capturing the agony that love sometimes can bring. But at the same time, being with that pain is what strengthens us. I once remember a metaphor that a Zen master gave me. He said, stand, just as when you were little, you went to the ocean beach and the big wave would come and you were like 6 years old and you'd be running as fast as you can because the giant wave you feel would drown you. Many of us relate to pain and sadness as if we allow that wave of sadness and pain to come, maybe it'll destroy us. But just as you grew up, you began to realize that when the wave comes, if you just stand your ground, the tall 8 foot wave will soak you to the skin. You will experience it, but then the wave will recede and you will still be standing. For us to know that it's the same thing with our fears, with our sadness, with the grief that we carry, that if only we allow us ourselves to experience it, it would probably pass. But often we are running from it. So the most important challenge to experience intimacy actually doesn't concern the other. It concerns oneself. It is falling in love with oneself. The greatest gift you can give yourself on Valentine's Day is not just to send flowers to your significant other, perhaps even more important, sorry, sorry for that. I didn't mute the speaker and microphone on time. The greatest gift you can give yourself is to start accepting yourself more today, is to start loving yourself more today, is to having more compassion for all the battles in life that you've gone through. Because the more you can accept yourself unconditionally, the more you can love yourself fully. That's what strengthens your capacity to love the other. And that enriches every relationship. Now, it is important also that in a few minutes we want to deal with the politics of relationships. And as you know, politics enters whenever another human being enters. Politics enters even when you're by yourself, because even within us, am I one person? There are probably 5 params inside of me. There's the nice param, the goofy param, the trying to act smart param, the cunning param. All of these are there. And sometimes politics enters even in my relationship with myself. I may be lying to myself. I may be deceiving myself. So it is very important for us to be very sensitive and aware, never self-condemning, accepting but aware of politics. So that's why, in fact, there's a beautiful book by Osho that I did not bring today. It's called Being in Love. Oh my God, it's one of the best books on love that I've read, Being in Love by Osho. I would encourage it to you. And there's a hilarious chapter at the beginning. It's called Soulmates or Cellmates. We start out wanting to be soulmates, but the dynamics among us often, we imprison ourselves in our relationships. We create relationships that don't add to our experience of freedom and joy, but to feeling imprisoned in them. And then we start feeling like cellmates. And one of the most important things you have to give up if you have to have love is your ego. Ego and love cannot exist. Just like you say, darkness, you cannot fight with darkness. You have to shine the light. The ego is something that can only be melted by the lantern of love. And the ego becomes so political. It is what leads to demands. We have demands of the other, and the other has to be perfect. And if they're not, they suck. We want to possess the other. We want to control the other, dominate the other. Unrealistic conditions that we place on each other. We fear people, or we make them afraid of us. Fear, all of these things are like poison. The ego, they come from the ego, and the ego has to be transcended. But there's no direct way to transcend the ego. The only way to transcend the ego is to become aware of how much of my life is being run by the ego, the extent to which the ego is in the driver's seat of my life. Just growing this awareness helps. If you remember, So the flower of love can only blossom when there is no ego, says Osho. And one of the stories that I've told in previous seminars, but for those of you who are new, is of a um, communication seminar I went to, where there was a husband and wife who were on the brink of divorce. And the seminar leader asked them to share their story. And the husband stood up and said, look, this is just an example. I come back home from work and all the toys of the two kids are strewn all over the floor. For 2 years, I've been telling my wife to pick them up. So when I come back, I don't have to trip over the toys. And this is something so simple she cannot do for me. It just drives me crazy. And so the seminar leader very quietly asked, I see you must live in a very big mansion. And the gentleman said, no, 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 it's just a 2-bedroom apartment. So the seminar leader asked, how long would it take for you to pick up those toys and put them away yourself when you come home? So the gentleman said, maybe it would take me like 5 minutes. So the seminar leader pointed out the irony. It would take you 5 minutes if you just decided to pick up the toys yourself and put them away. But you find it more satisfying, more gratifying to fight with your wife for 3 hours of how she did not put away the toys. And while we might see this and laugh about it, we do the same thing in our lives. There are so many things that we could just take care of and handle, but our fondness for conflict, our addiction to conflict, our addiction to misery, you know, leads us, to constantly seek conflict, provocation, and unhappiness, because that unhappiness and conflict seems comforting. Perhaps in your childhood, you had a lot of conflict and you got so used to it that we tend to generate that dynamic over and over again. And that's really one of the challenges. So love actually needs a constant of deep gratitude. And I would say, when you can trust the other person unconditionally and give them all the freedom they ask for without ever worrying about that freedom being betrayed, there is something very transformative that happens to the other person when they're so profoundly trusted and unconditionally accepted. When you accept me unconditionally, my heart opens to you in such a way that I feel and experience a deep sense of gratitude. And I express that gratitude to you, that then causes you to be grateful to me and causes you to accept me and for me to accept you. And in that, escalating circle of gratitude and freedom, love blossoms. So loving people unconditionally and accepting them for who they are, and that can only happen when we love ourselves unconditionally and accept ourselves for who we are, happens. It creates freedom. The other person feels more free. And to remember that there are two kinds of arithmetic, says Osho. The kind of arithmetic that we've been taught is the wrong kind, where if there is 4 and you take away two, you're left with only 2. 4 minus 2 is equal to 2. But in love, in matters where being is involved, consciousness is involved, the more you give, the more you have. The more loving I am to the people around me, the more loving they are going to be to me. So the more love I will have in my life, the more of it that I give. So it's a totally different kind of mathematics, a totally different kind of arithmetic, where the more you give, the more you have. And often we wait for the perfect partner and we say, I will love the perfect partner. There's a joke about, Osho tells about a man said, there's only once in my life that I met the perfect partner, and I believe in marrying my perfect partner. I've never met a person like that. That's the person I should have married. Well, the gentleman was asked, then why didn't you marry her? He said, but she was also looking for a perfect partner, and she didn't think I was that partner. So how often we miss because we are looking for perfection. Wake up, folks. What makes human beings beautiful is that they're not perfect. What makes human beings beautiful is that they're messed up. What makes people beautiful is that we are dysfunctional. If you can see the beauty, the modern art, if you will, of like having a bunch of colors thrown on a painting as it looks for somebody who's not a connoisseur of art and who doesn't understand art, human beings are masterpieces. They have lived through many battles. They have been ingenious. And Valentine's Day is an opportunity to look at everyone around us. And I want this relationship, not seminar, webinar, not just to apply to romantic love, but any kind of love. Look at your children and you with eyes of love. notice that each one of them is a mystery, is an ocean of mystery. We know this in our romantic relationships. When I say that a mystery, how many of you wake up on a day with your significant other, you wake them up, and then you're greeted by a dancing dolphin, and you say, how beautiful. The next day, you expect the same response, the same reaction. You wake up your significant other expecting to be met by a dancing dolphin, and a shark appears and bites off your head. That's what makes relationships beautiful. If we strive for security and safety in our relationships, relationships will be dead. Let your relationship be like a festival of spices. Sometimes it'll cause you to sneeze, and sometimes it'll cause you to cough, and sometimes it'll cause you to inhale your fragrance more deeply. So, on that note, I'm going to be ending the formal part of the webinar. For those of you who've been with us before, you understand how this works. We end the formal presentation of the webinar where I'm doing all the talking, and then people of their own volition and will, they can either log off and say goodbye, and we wish you all a happy Valentine's Day and weekend, or you can choose to stay for a little bit of an interactive discussion where people share questions, stories, thoughts, and for the next half an hour, and we wrap up around 2:45 or 3. So you're welcome to choose either model. This is the point where I have to stop the recording because I'm not supposed to record other people sharing things as far as possible. So I want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for your presence, for the love that you've shown, for your own spiritual growth, and for me and affection by showing up at this seminar and joining us today. So thank you all. May you go ahead and radiate love to all those people who you know, and may love shower upon you this weekend. Thank you. I'm going to pause the recording. You can log off or you can wait and participate in a short discussion if you wish. The microphones, you should be able to unmute yourself. Could somebody unmute themselves? And